Yes, a very good morning to you. It's Tuesday, the 11th of August, 2020. Welcome back to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. My name's Pete Fairbairn, and as always, I'm joined by one of the sharpest minds, and today in Australasian sports media, to discuss five of the biggest stories making waves in the world of sport. For the first time on the Weekday Kickoff, we cross over the ditch to esteemed journalist Paul Cully, who joins us from Dunedin via stuff.co.nz. How are you this morning, Paul?
I'm good, Pete. How are you, mate?
Mate, I'm very well. Great to have you on the show for the first time. Of course, many of you who follow the sport of rugby will be familiar with Paul's work over the years for the Sydney Morning Herald and now with stuff.co.nz. And the irony of an Irishman based in New Zealand knowing so much about Australian rugby is lost on nobody. So we will, of course, go there at some stage throughout this morning's show. But we are going to start in rugby league, Paul, and your namesake Paul McGregor at the St George Illawarra Dragons. It looks like he may be coming to the end of his tenure. Story by Phil Rothfield in the Daily Telegraph today says that Dragons CEO Ryan Webb has put the future of the Dragons coach Paul McGregor on the agenda for next Tuesday's board meeting. It's looking like, I suppose, a tenure that hasn't seen a great deal of success for the Dragons, maybe drawing towards a close. We look at some of the challenges they've had this year, not only in regards to getting some wins, but also the challenges fitting in some of their highest paid players into their team, the likes of Ben Hunt, Corey Norman. Hasn't been a great deal of continuity in the team selection every week. And it looks like for all parties, that's probably going to draw to what seemed a pretty inevitable conclusion. From your perspective, Paul, would it be fair enough if the Dragons were to move on coach Paul McGregor?
Well, let me say from the outset that traditionally, I'm not a supporter of moving on coaches. I think it's done too quickly, and I think there's no guarantees when you bring the next guy in. I mean, I look at New Zealand rugby. Last year, the Chiefs moved on Colin Cooper 2 years into a 3-year deal, brought in Warren Gatland, and Warren Gatland's now lost 8 games on the bounce. So there's no guarantees with changing coaches. However, in this instance, you look at it, and has McGregor had enough time to make an impact? I think he has. And are the Dragons right to listen to their fans in this one? Of course they are. I mean, the record has been poor. I don't see really much signs of progress. So, I mean, I don't think he would have any complaints if he's moved on.
There's been a lot of speculation that Craig Fitzgibbon, of course, the Sydney Roosters assistant coach and former Dragons superstar, is the man being lined up to take on that role. He recently said that he wouldn't leave the Roosters before the end of his contract there, and there was talk that may lead to McGregor getting a bit of a stay of execution for another 18 months or so. It doesn't look to be the case, according to Rothfield's article and numerous other reports this morning as well. So it'll be interesting to see who could be lined up at the joint venture club. We stay in rugby league for our second story. And this is a really heartwarming story. In what's been a tough season, I think one of the enduring images was that of the small New South Wales town, Tamworth, welcoming the New Zealand Warriors to stay there and quarantine there in order to get the NRL season back up and running. Back in May when COVID had obviously halted that season, the Warriors spent a couple of weeks in Tamworth. They weren't able to do much within the community in a very strict bubble there, but they did have a town who bent over backwards to accommodate them and allow them to prepare for the NRL season. And great news yesterday with the Warriors announcing that their match against the Newcastle Knights in 2.5 weeks' time will actually be held in Tamworth at Scully Park. A wonderful reward, I guess, for that town and the support they gave the Warriors when really nobody else wanted them. And having attended an NRC match there, it's a fantastic little facility. So the players certainly will get an opportunity to play on a great little stadium. Being across the ditch, Paul, I want to ask you, how proud is New Zealand as a nation in regards to the sacrifices that the Warriors have made to keep the NRL season going?
Look, I think there's recognition here of the sacrifices that they've made. I'm not sure pride is the right word, maybe a bit more sympathy for what they've had to go through. I mean, you've got to remember that these are young men, some of them with young families, and had been promised that their families would be able to join them. That hasn't proved to be the case. So I think there's a lot of respect is probably the word that New Zealanders are feeling for the Warriors. The way that they conducted themselves, obviously lost a coach as well, who the players liked. and yet they're still eking out wins. So, I mean, I think there's a huge amount of admiration for what they've done, and way beyond the call of duty, really. I think what the Warriors players have gone through, and I'd like to ask you about this as well, because of your background working with players, and you know that the pressures that they're under in terms of family requirements. I mean, how do you see this one in terms of the sacrifice that they've made?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think without the sacrifice they've made, the season doesn't get up and running, and it gives the broadcaster an excuse to say that you're not meeting the requirements, and therefore we're not going to pay you the big bucks. And that has massive ramifications for the sustainability of the clubs, the league. The players go without pay, all sorts of flow-on effects from that. So I guess firstly, without the Warriors making that sacrifice, I don't think we see the NRL season able to be played. Secondly, you're spot on. Being away from home, being away from your family, extraordinary pressure in what is already an extremely intensive vocation, for lack of a better word. And the changing climate around COVID has meant that what they were expecting and anticipating in regards to family being able to come and join them hasn't been able to eventuate. We've seen some Warriors players return to New Zealand due to family circumstances there. Those guys probably stayed on longer than they really wanted to. Name escapes me, but I know there's a player in Australia at the moment who actually probably won't be able to return to New Zealand as things currently stand when the season finishes, because he's actually Tongan, and his work visa won't allow him to return to the country he has called home for a number of years. So extraordinarily selfless. Again, we've seen a lot of clubs talk about how grateful they are for the Warriors, but not be forthcoming in providing loan players when the Warriors have desperately needed it. So I think it's been a remarkably selfless act. I think it's great to see a match going to Tamworth, a town that got behind them when no one else would. And it's been really good to see the Warriors get a couple of wins in recent weeks after, as you said, sacking a coach who the players were really close with.
Yeah, I mean, you can only echo that, can't you? I mean, I think as the years roll on as well, the extent of that sacrifice will become even more apparent, because the players will get their opportunities to tell their stories. And I think some of them will be pretty harrowing.
Yeah, I agree. We move to rugby union now. Sorry, that story about the Warriors coming from your colleague David Long at stuff.co.nz. And in rugby union, a story from Tom Decent in the Sydney Morning Herald. He's got some quotes from Rugby Australia boss Rob Clark, who spoke yesterday, suggesting that a Champions League style Super 8 concept featuring top 2 finishers in each of the Sanzar nations could run after either a domestic or trans-Tasman equivalent runs beforehand. He's also talking about including Australian rugby's own State of Origin series, and also discussing separating the broadcast package, perhaps Super Rugby and International Rugby forming one broadcast offering, Club Rugby forming another, as he looks to create some competitive tension within that market. Also, the big news that he wouldn't include the 2025 British and Irish Lions series in these current broadcast negotiations. But I think the greatest, insight I take out of this is that, again, Rob Clark not interested in kowtowing to any New Zealand demands for a trans-Tasman competition featuring less than 5 Australian teams. Clark essentially saying that 5 Aussie teams is what we want. That's on the table if New Zealand want a trans-Tasman competition. However, if they're not willing to include 5 Australian teams, we'll do our own domestic comp. Following the game closely from over there, Paul, how have you seen Rugby Australia's single-minded determination to look after themselves, first and foremost, in discussions about the future of Super Rugby?
Well, I think it's necessary, isn't it? I mean, everybody is aware that the game in Australia has reached the crossroads, and they need to. This next deal is so important that they need to get it right. In terms of the trans-Tasman, I spoke to Rob Clark last night, and I spoke to Hamish McLennan a couple of days ago. I think there's still a fair bit of distance between the parties. I would not be surprised if next year we have separate competitions. Having said that, Rob did tell me last night that in the event of a trans-Tasman competition, Rugby Australia would not be pursuing a 50-50 split, even though the teams would be 5 each. So Rugby Australia is aware of the commercial realities. New Zealand's got a great relationship with Sky and has a big deal with Sky here. So Rugby Australia is not after that even split. Rob also said something very interesting. He said that Sky, he believed that Rugby Australia has been led to believe that Sky would prefer Trans-Tasman competition. They don't want to go with Super Rugby Aotearoa again, despite its success. So what we have here is two parties that are far apart at the minute, but despite all the headlines, I think there is certainly a willingness on the Australian side to get something done. That's their preference. So the ball really is now in New Zealand's court. How far do they want to push this? And if Rugby Australia is right about the Sky thing, if they do want a Trans-Tasman competition and have told New Zealand Rugby that, then we may get something done. But at the minute, I think it's 50-50. Hamish McLennan told me it's 50-50. And that's the way I'm looking at it. What are your thoughts on this one, Pete? I know that you're a supporter of the line that Rugby Australia has taken.
Yeah, I've been really impressed. We spoke yesterday, Paul, about, I suppose, Rob Clark and Hamish McLennan being on the same page for a start. That's something that's been lacking perhaps in the past in Rugby Australia from an administrative perspective. Personally, having worked with Rob, I have a lot of respect for him and the way he operates, and he's very open to thinking outside the square. He is a marketing man at heart. So he also understands the need for the competition to be able to commercially cut its own cloth, I guess. And to your point that he's not necessarily demanding a 50-50 split, that's the type of outside the box thinking that his background can provide. I think it's critical for Australian rugby that it has 5 professional teams and that it has a national footprint. I think that's the only way that we retain relevance nationwide and ensure that it's not a completely niche sport over here. I appreciate that there's some challenges perhaps in playing depth in comparison to New Zealand, but New Zealand is a conveyor belt of talent and has been for a long time. And perhaps sometimes we need to look with a bigger picture and appreciate that we won't always have that same conveyor belt of talent, but let's do our absolute utmost to actually keep them here through a dynamic competition, excellent coaching, and treating our players like the genuine assets they are. So I think as well, New Zealand rugby players probably are a little wary of bashing into each other with a lot of local derbies moving forward. And I wouldn't be surprised to see the Players Association over there. Yes, they'll be looking out for what's best for New Zealand rugby, but if the players don't want to be playing the Super Rugby Aotearoa version, perhaps Rob Nichol and the Players Association across the ditch may have a bit to say about that.
True. The other thing I would add, and I don't think it's been in the conversation much thus far, but obviously I've got the New Zealand perspective. I think everybody understands that Australia's got certain domestic pressures in terms of winning back the fan base, etc. New Zealand also has pressures. New Zealand fans have been drifting away from Super Rugby. Super Rugby Aotearoa has reconnected them with the game. So New Zealand rugby is under pressure here to produce a product that engages its fans. Don't take it as granted that everybody in New Zealand is a rugby fan, is going to be a rugby fan in 10 years' time. Sports like basketball here are starting to draw young people, especially young men, away from the game. Participation levels are under a little bit of pressure. So that's the sort of background to these negotiations from a New Zealand perspective that they're bringing to the table. I think there's a viewpoint sometimes that rugby is guaranteed success in New Zealand. It's not quite the case anymore. So they have to produce something, a product that they want, that their fans are going to buy into, and they see that as that's where that 8-team model came from. A lot of that research that they did was with their supporters, and their supporters told them, we don't want a bloated competition, we want that 8-team model. You can agree or disagree with that, but I think it's important sort of background and to let people know in Australia, this is one of the reasons why New Zealand rugby's been quite firm on that.
It's the whole reason why I try and make sure we have the best possible journalists around to be on the show, because they provide that context and that extra insight. And I've let this story run a little bit longer than usual today, so we're going to go to a fourth and final story today because I am conscious of time, and it's a story from BBC Sport, who have done their annual Women in Sport survey. They've surveyed over 1,000 professional athletes in regards to all sorts of things about their experience of being elite female athletes. Some pretty damning stats within that. Social media abuse, roughly, and I'll bring the numbers up here. 20% of female athletes have experienced or witnessed racism in their sport. 65% have experienced sexism in their sport. 36% do not feel supported by their club or governing body to have a baby and continue to compete. 78% are conscious of their body image, and some pretty awful testimonials about some of the social media abuse that these athletes have been copping. In general, Paul, and just really quickly, how much pressure is there and how much responsibility is there on sporting bodies all over the world to protect their female athletes better and all athletes in general from social media abuse?
I think it's probably top two issues in sport right now. We talk a lot about mental welfare, and this is what it means, doesn't it? Because I had a look at those figures, and the social media abuse was of female athletes was terrible. And it's not just female athletes, female journalists get it, I know as well. And that is an intolerable strain on young women. You've got to remember the age of these people. They're not in their 30s or 40s. It doesn't brush off as it easily does when you're a bit older. And sports organizations have to be in front of this problem because it is a huge issue. And it would make you think, if you had a daughter, would you want them to be a high-profile sportswoman, or would they have to stop doing something that they love just because they're getting so much abuse? I think it's a terrible and really sad story.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing I would add as well is that a common response is often, well, just don't go on social media and don't have a presence there. But for a lot of these athletes, and it does reference in this story that, so many of them are actually earning less than the average wage in the UK. And social media is an opportunity for them to build their profile, their commerciality, to attract and retain partners and to actually prepare for life after sport, which is a tremendously difficult transition for them to navigate as well. So the argument, don't go on social media, just doesn't cut it. I think it is time for governing bodies, and we know the social media companies don't really want to sit down and have this conversation. So governing bodies need to put in place some really strict measures on how hard they're going to come down on any so-called fans of the sport and the athletes and punish them for any unacceptable behaviour online. Paul, we're going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time, but what a pleasure it's been to have you on the show this morning. Love to have you back again, and the insight you've been able to provide into Super Rugby in particular is certainly an area we'll continue to watch with interest. Thanks so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks, Pete.
That's the end of the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff for today. We'll be back tomorrow. Look forward to chatting with you then. Cheers.